Sometimes warfare drives designs so bizarre that in peacetime they probably wouldn't have left the drawing board. Warships have come in all different shapes and sizes, and these, well, they're just some of the weirdest. From the enormous French ironclads that were more like floating castles, to the British submarine with a 50-ton sniper rifle bolted onto it, the British battleships too big for their own good, the American aircraft carriers made out of old paddle-wheel passenger ships, and finally, the tiny Italian monitor with the battleship's main gun. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Warship Designs, and these are some of the most bizarre warships from history. In the realm of naval conflict, there are few warships that could claim to be so bizarre, so spectacularly strange as France's pre-dreadnoughts, and leading the pack was the warship Carnot. With her exaggerated tumble-home hull and 274mm gun turrets perched on each side, the Carnot is today classified as a pre-dreadnought battleship, and these were the dominant style of battleship in many of Europe's navies between 1880 and 1900, replacing the earlier ironclads of the 1860s and 70s. The pre-dreadnoughts were, as their name suggests, built before the dominating HMS Dreadnought, whose design came to define battleships of the 20th century. But before then, battleships were decidedly more awkward in appearance and layout, with a dazzling mix of gun calibers and weirdly shaped hulls and structures. Carnot is probably one of the strangest. She was the second of 5 broadly similar French battleships, alongside her semi-sister ships, the Charles Martel, the Jaurès-Guibéry, the Masséna, and Bouvet, all named for famous French commanders and statesmen. These 5 ships were in turn an evolution of France's first pre-dreadnought, the notoriously unstable Brenu. While the ships were similar, there were enough differences between them that they couldn't be considered really a single class. It's true that Carnot and her half-sisters were far from identical, but they did, however, share a fantastic, almost steampunk profile and a reputation for instability when out at sea. For the latter part of the 19th century, France had been the world's second strongest naval power, so Britain's Naval Defence Act of 1889, which sought to dramatically increase the strength of the already dominating Royal Navy, spurred the French Admiralty into action. The French hastily introduced legislation to grow and modernise their own navy substantially, in an attempt to maintain their position as the world's number 2 on the high seas. Now, the French had built some fine warships, particularly their ironclads, in the second half of the 1800s, which makes the curious design of their new naval ships and their shortcomings even more fascinating. Built at Toulon, Carnot was laid down in 1891, measuring 114 metres or 374 feet long. She had a beam of about 21 metres or 70 feet and displaced a whopping 11,954 tonnes. So she was in many ways an evolution of Charles Martel. Like Brenu, whose design was adapted for Carnot and her 4 running mates, it was found that Charles Martel was also top-heavy and unstable. Now, this top-heaviness was mostly due to her gargantuan superstructure. Despite her tendency to pitch and roll in heavy weather, Charles Martel had a high freeboard, that is the height between the waterline and the top of the hull, or basically how much ship there is actually above the waterline. So she did handle rough weather conditions pretty well. Considering her inherent top-heavy nature, modifications were made to Carnot's design to address the instability seen in Charles Martel, and they were largely made to Carnot's superstructure in an attempt to lower her centre of gravity. While all of the Carnot's half-sisters were unconventional, Carnot herself was the ship that probably broke the mold the most. Take her funnels, for example. Most ships have funnels that are arranged in sets of nearly identical dimensions, but not the Carnot. Her forward funnel was actually larger than that of her after one, and noticeably so. Now obviously, like all battleships, Carnot's guns were her most important feature. In fact, it was those enormous guns that really helped to make her look so strange. In particular were those 274mm gun turrets, which sat either side of her hull. To that end, Carnot's hull was built with an extremely exaggerated tumble home, that is, the narrowing of the hull above the waterline and flaring out towards it, a common feature on battleships in the early days. But Carnot's tumble home was something else, presumably intended to give the ship ample stability while reducing the weight higher up. Built into her hull were a vast number of portholes and windows. It's almost as though she was designed to look like a battleship of the late 17th century with gun ports dotted along her sides. Of course, drilling holes in a battleship isn't probably the smartest move, and the portholes weren't to Carnot's advantage, dramatically reducing the effectiveness of her watertight compartments and her armoured protection. Her foremast, perched atop her turret-like bridge, gives the impression of a turret on a castle. The whole effect is a ship that seriously looks like a floating fortress, and when underway with her funnels absolutely belching smoke, she could even be thought to resemble a factory. But despite her spectacular appearance, the Carnot had a relatively uneventful career. By the time she was completed in 1897, she was already obsolete, especially in comparison to the vessels being used by the British. Her first role after being commissioned into the French fleet was to steam with two of her half-sisters, Charles Martel and Jaurès Guibéry, to join with the great European navies in the International Squadron. A major conflict was brewing on Crete, with uprisings against the island's Ottoman rule escalating. The role of Carnot off Crete was minor. She spent the rest of her career alternating between the French Navy's northern and Mediterranean squadrons. By the end of the 1900s, Carnot was becoming even more out of date, especially once Britain's incredible HMS Dreadnought redefined battleship design totally, as well as construction. But it wasn't just Dreadnought that placed Carnot at risk of scrapping. France had begun introducing the much more modern Danton-class battleships in 1911. In fact, the rate of design improvement was such that by January 1913, Carnot was nothing more than a spare, and she would have looked like a relic from a bygone era. She wasn't called upon for service in World War I, but surprisingly, she saw out the war laid up with Charles Martel instead of being scrapped. She was officially struck from the French Navy's register in 1922 and sold for scrap, little more than a museum piece at a time when battleships had been refined into superb masters of the ocean. Now look, it's probably easy to imagine France's enormous floating castle, with the guns just strapped onto her side, as maybe a failure. She was hardly used as a battleship, notoriously unstable, and sat through the largest conflict the world had seen idly. But the reality was that Carnot and her half-siblings were built as a scramble to modernise an ailing fleet, as naval developments forged on with an unrelenting disregard for those who couldn't keep up. Carnot and her half-siblings weren't hugely successful in service, but thankfully they kind of didn't need to be. The 1890s and the early 1900s were fairly peaceful in comparison to what would come in the 1910s, with Carnot and her companions tiding the French Navy over until more modern warships could be built. But fortunately, their existence provides us today with some truly dramatic photos from a time when floating factories and castles ruled the waves. What happens when you strap a 50-ton gun to a submarine? Well, in the First World War, the Royal Navy wanted to find out. Now, we all know the traditional recipe for a First and Second World War era submarine was for a relatively small, maneuverable vessel with a light deck gun. Of course, the defining feature of a submarine is its ability to submerge, often for long periods of time, hours on end, but war always opens the door for experimentation, and the British were just as keen as their enemies to explore some unusual avenues to gain the upper hand. Introducing the British M-class submarine, a glass cannon that packed a massive punch. The M-class submarines were in many ways similar to other British subs around the time of the First World War. They were longer than Germany's U-boats, with the first of the class, HMS M1, coming in at an impressive 295 feet or 90 meters, with a slightly greater displacement than that of the German equivalent, like the U-151. Remember, submarines of the time usually featured small, relatively light deck gun calibers, similar to light cruisers or the secondaries you might find on battleships. Originally, submarines had adhered to cruiser rules. They surfaced, ordered their prey to stop, and then be abandoned, and then sank them with their deck guns. But as the war went on, and the so-called prey began to fight back, the torpedo became the main weapon of the submarine. Now, the M-class subs did carry torpedoes, but they also carried an absolutely enormous 12-inch 40 caliber cannon. Now, for those of you who aren't big gun aficionados, this 12-inch gun had a bore length of a whopping 480 inches over 12 meters, about the length of a bus. It weighed over 50 tons, a monstrous thing installed by the mad lads at Armstrong Whitworth. But the truth is, the guns were made for a very different original purpose. They had equipped the formidable class pre-Dreadnought battleships, which were being removed from service by the end of the war because they were tragically outdated. But their guns still worked just fine, so onto the M-class submarines they went. So why did the British Admiralty decide that the M-class submarine would be best served by a simply massive 50-ton gun? Well, believe it or not, it may not have been as crazy a concept as it sounds. The Royal Navy had hoped to operate 4 M-class subs in place of the final 4 K-class submarines that had been planned. The K-class had been canned, for very good reasons that we've covered before. The M-Class was supposed to be a submersible monitor that could easily surface, fire at a target either at sea or on land, and then quickly disappear below the waves again. It was thought that the gun would be more effective against moving ships at close ranges than torpedoes. A hit at close range from this gargantuan gun would have been devastating, especially on unarmoured merchant ships or lightly armoured destroyers or cruisers. Firing from periscope depth at close range, the gun was easy to aim using a simple bead sight aligned with the periscope, effectively giving the submarine's commander a 31cm, 12-inch diameter sniper rifle. And honestly, as a guy who enjoys firing historic firearms, I'm a little jealous. In theory, it was a good idea. A hit from a 12-inch gun would obliterate most targets submarines encountered while they were on patrol. But, of course, the gun did have some drawbacks, despite its awesome firepower. Actually, there were quite a few drawbacks. The gun was difficult to operate because it had to be squeezed into a housing forward of the conning tower in a space so tight that men could barely stand up inside without banging their heads. The fairing did give some small amount of traverse to the gun, 15 degrees port or starboard and 20 degrees up, but it effectively turned the submarine into something more akin to an ocean-going turretless tank destroyer. Coupled with the fact the submarine, being fairly small, would be tossed around by the waves, and there was no stabilization provided, it surely would have made actually aiming and firing the gun beyond anything but close range a very interesting proposal indeed. But if actually using the gun proved tricky, then taking care of it was a whole other thing entirely. If the correct procedure wasn't followed exactly to prepare it for firing, or if water managed to enter the barrel while the sub was submerged, it could be easily damaged. On no fewer than 2 occasions, HMS M1 lost half her barrel length of the 12-inch gun because water had managed to get into it before firing. The gun was usually fired from periscope depth, but it was relatively slow to reload because the submarine had to surface and it took crews over 3 minutes to load a new round, leaving their submarine vulnerable to attack. And the M-Class, with its fragile pressure hull and protruding large conning tower, was never meant to engage in a gun duel. The concept would only work if the M-Class could fire one shot, knock out their target in one fell swoop, and escape. Because the gun was so heavy, it also affected the vessel's handling. When she was submerged, the M-Class subs were actually very well behaved, but when they surfaced, they were really top-heavy, which is a characteristic common among many of the unhinged warships we've looked at. If you're starting to see a couple of flaws in the plan and you think maybe the theory behind it might be a little bit wonky, then congratulations, because you seem to have more foresight than the British Admiralty did, because they decided to go ahead with a few M-Class submarines to see what they could do, and the results weren't great. The British Navy had hoped to put 4 M-Classes into service, but only 3 were ever commissioned. Of those planned, only HMS M1, completed in 1917, was operating before the conclusion of the war, and once peace had returned to Europe, there was little need for these submarine monitors and their effectiveness couldn't really be tested properly in action. The M-Class subs were dealt another blow in 1922, with the Washington Naval Convention restricting submarine armament, effectively putting the idea of the submarine monitor to bed for good. After the Washington Naval Convention, only the M1 retained her 12-inch gun, and her career was largely uneventful. She was mostly used to carry out training exercises. But unfortunately, the M1 didn't enjoy a benign end in a scrapyard after years of uneventful service. On the 19th of November, 1925, the Swedish collier Vidar reported a collision with an unknown object, which had happened a few days earlier on the morning of the 12th November off the coast of Devon. Now, HMS M1 had been missing since the morning of the 12th, where she'd been conducting exercises with 2 of her sister subs. When Vidar's damaged hull was examined, it was found that she had paint matching the missing submarines. The timing of the collision and the paint on Vidar's hull all but confirmed the fate of HMS M1. Vidar had actually ripped M1's massive gun clean off, and the resulting hole allowed the vessel to rapidly flood and sink like a stone. Her crew had made a rush to escape, but it all happened so quickly, and her entire crew of 70 lost their lives. After the loss of M1 in 1925, M2 and M3 were reassigned for experimental use. By this time, it seems the Navy had a bit of an inkling that the submarine monitor was a bit of a white elephant. Both vessels lost their famous 12-inch guns, with M2 getting a new but exciting task. Forward of her conning tower, where the monstrous gun had once been, a hangar was installed. HMS M2 had become one of the first aircraft-carrying submarines. She carried a specially designed seaplane, the Parnell Peto, And that small biplane was designed to Admiralty specifications, and it also posed significant challenges for designers because the hangar it would have been stored in was extremely small. So the solution was to, of course, make the wings foldable, allowing the plane to be stored more easily. Initially, the plane was to be lowered into the water by an overhead crane, and it would take off from the water. But in 1928, a hydraulic system was installed, allowing the plane to take off straight from M2's deck. It was hoped that the M2 would prove the concept of the aircraft-carrying submarine, and she was used for years for naval exercises, but her career too would be cut short like that of her sister. On January 26, 1932, M2 left her base off the Isle of Portland in the English Channel, heading to conduct exercises off the Dorset coast. Now, this kind of work was routine for M2 and her crew, and there was no reason to think that anything unusual would happen. At 10:11 a.m, she radioed her submarine depot ship, the Titania, that she planned to dive around 20 minutes later, but she was never heard from again, and all 60 of her men lost their lives. Unlike M1, M2's wreck was located just over a week after her sinking. In fact, there were even plans, and then attempts to raise the wreckage, one almost successful, but in the end the plans were abandoned, and HMS M2 still lies in the English Channel. When the wreck was discovered, it was found that her hangar door was still open, clearly an indicator of a huge failure either in procedure or technology. Either her crew had failed to shut the door properly, if at all, or that the hangar door itself had failed outright, an improper seal causing flooding perhaps, or even that the hydroplanes, which were supposed to help keep the submarine on the surface early into the airplane launching procedure in a pinch, had failed. The M2 would have dropped like a stone with the hangar door still wide open. Chillingly, a distress message was found the next month scratched onto a chunk of wood paneling, simply saying, "Help, M2 gone down, number 2 hatch open." Interestingly, after the loss of M2, the Royal Navy totally abandoned the idea of aircraft carrying submarines, although Japan in particular carried on with the concept and eventually perfected it. In the end, the final remaining M-class sub, the M3, had been converted to become an experimental mine layer in 1928, and the days of the British submarine monitor were over for good. Fortunately, this role was marred only by mediocrity instead of tragedy, when it was found that her refit badly affected her handling and diving. In rough weather, the M3 was a sitting duck, taking up to 13 minutes to dive compared to the 60 to 80 seconds of her contemporaries. So shortly after M2's demise, the British Admiralty decided to strike the M3 from their register and sell her for scrap. The M-class subs never got to realise their potential in battle, and maybe, just maybe, that enormous 12-inch sniper rifle could have done some damage in exactly the right set of circumstances. But it seems fairly unlikely, and today they exist only as a distant memory of a time when a massive gun on a fairly small submarine seemed to make a good deal of sense. Usually, with technological advancements, you have the before and the after, and then a very awkward somewhere in between. Battleships were no exception, and we've had a lot of fun talking about the weird time in the Royal Navy when wooden sailing ships, which had basically been perfected over hundreds of years, gave way to iron steamships, which often left a lot to be desired. One fun example of these is Britain's Colossus-class battleships, ironclads which implemented a few firsts for the Royal Navy and the world. The Colossus-class battleship was born out of an era where the French, British, German, American, Russian and Italian navies rushed to compete with each other with each successive class of battleship. In a running skirmish between guns and armour, the British had a series of successes and failures. HMS Ajax had been a class-leading battleship when she was laid down in 1876, but it took 4 years to complete her, and even then, on trials, she was found to exhibit some bad behaviour. Such was the pace of design and the frantic construction schedule at the time that even before Ajax was finished and in service, designs were already put into place for an improved class of battleship. Now, the key to Colossus's development was the introduction in the Royal Navy of breech-loading guns. These had been tested years earlier, but they proved dangerous and unpredictable. But the development of an automatic safety device meant breech loaders were at last capable of being fired with reliability in mind. And the simple fact was that a breech-loaded gun was a bigger and more powerful gun than a muzzle-loaded one, for the fact that large shells and bags of powder could be more easily fed into the breech at the back instead of being stuffed down the muzzle. This resulted in the development of a big 12-inch 25 caliber gun. The Navy just needed something to put it on. Colossus was originally proposed to be significantly longer than any other British battleship in service, but the Admiralty settled on a more modest 325-foot length. But still, her slightly longer hull and shallower beam meant she could squeeze an extra knot of speed out over her contemporaries. Colossus's true pioneering chops lay in the fact she was the first to use steel rather than iron for nearly all of the hull structure aside from the stem and stern castings, and she was the first truly modern battleship to field big, breech-loading rifled guns in turrets. The guns were impressive for the time. In trials, Colossus managed a blistering 4 rounds in 6 minutes from one gun and even scored 3 hits on a target at full steam. Breech loaders were just fast like that. In a naval battle, the amount of time and labour saved can make all the difference. On their sea trials, both Colossus-class ships performed well and vastly exceeded their contract design speeds, with Colossus, underloaded, hitting 16.5 knots, which threw up an enormous bow wave described as being like a solid wall of water 13 feet long. Crucially, they improved on the Ajax-class's sea handling characteristics, but they still left a lot to be desired. Gun ports were only 12 feet above the waterline, and if the ship rolled just 13 degrees, the gun's muzzles would kiss the water if they were trained to the side. They had a quick roll, which required the fitting of large tanks down below to stabilise them, but their massive height meant they were liable to catch the wind and be carried off course were the helmsman not paying attention. In fact, this is why Colossus has made this list for the most unhinged warship designs. She towered high out of the water, with a hull that stood up like a steampunk wall stories tall, and there in the centre of the ship were her twin gun turrets, which, thanks to the raised forecastle and stern, had to be offset to fire forward or aft. For good measure, she was fitted with a ram bow, a device that did much more to act as a bulbous bow and cut down her fuel consumption at speed. While the technological achievements of the Colossus class are notable, her career and that of her sister was more mundane. The pair engaged in training and testing, but were rendered obsolete just a few short years after their introduction. It must have been an exciting time to be a naval architect in the British Admiralty, when the government poured funds into creating the biggest and baddest warships the world had yet seen at an exponential rate. While they were definitely not without their growing pains, the Colossus class of battleship was a success, even if it was a short-lived one. With their towering hulls and funnels, the class certainly lived up to their name. They were true steam leviathans of the Victorian world. If you're an Admiralty, say, and you desperately need aircraft carriers, but you don't have any, maybe you've got some passenger ships lying around that you can convert into aircraft carriers, and that's great. But what if those passenger ships are paddle wheel excursion steamers? In the early years of the Second World War, the United States had a bit of a problem. Its aircraft carriers were tied up in the Pacific Theatre, seeing desperate action in huge battles like Midway and the Coral Sea. They'd gone from mere curiosities to becoming the backbone of the modern Navy, and they had to be protected at all costs. But back home, pilots needed training for carrier operations, which came with their own quirks and immense dangers. Pilots landing on aircraft carriers faced a whole host of dangers their land-based colleagues didn't have to. For one, the weather was totally beyond the crew's control, and it could shift drastically on approach to the carrier. Chief among quirks for training carrier pilots was the length of the landing zone itself. Land-based pilots could enjoy runways thousands of feet long, but carrier pilots had just a short few hundred feet to work with. They had to put their aircraft down with pinpoint accuracy, usually just above stall speed. Of course, then the runway they were landing on was moving by itself as well. The early carrier pilots were their own breed of gutsy daredevil, but without an actual aircraft carrier to train on, pilots would be woefully underprepared when they got to the actual theatre of operations. This is where some Navy planners got a clever, unhinged idea. The SS C&B was a grand passenger steamer launched in November 1912 by the Detroit Shipbuilding Company in Michigan. Named using the initials of its owners, the Cleveland and Buffalo Transit Company, C&B, get it? The C&B boasted accommodations for over 1,500 passengers. At 500 feet, or 152 metres in length, and 58 feet, or 17.6 metres in beam, she was among the largest and most opulent passenger steamers on the Great Lakes. And she was, in fact, the largest sidewheel steamer in the world at the time, a fact that would come in very handy for the Navy. She had boasted an impressive array of amenities aimed at passenger comfort, including staterooms, elegant dining saloons, and spacious promenade decks. In fact, the decision to use old-fashioned inclined steam engines was taken specifically for passengers who wanted a good night's sleep on board. The engines could develop impressive horsepower at low revolutions, creating less vibration, and making for a more comfortable trip. She was an impressive, quirky ship to be sure, and the SS C&B served the Great Lakes region for over 2 decades. But then came the Second World War. Navy Commander Richard Whitehead had come up with the idea of making use of lake steamers for training purposes, but it took some time for the seemingly ludicrous idea to catch on. Remarkably though, the SS C&B was acquired by the Navy in March 1942 and underwent a radical transformation. Her impressive length and beam made her an ideal platform for use as a training aircraft carrier, and Navy workers got started on converting her. Her luxurious accommodations and superstructure were removed, and in their place a flat-top flight deck was installed along with a small island superstructure. She was fitted with arresting cables that would seize landing aircraft, and it was reported by the Buffalo Courier Express that 45 miles of welding and 45,000 bolts went into her. Commissioned as the USS Wolverine in August 1942, because Michigan is known as the Wolverine State, go Spartans, the vessel became one of 2 freshwater aircraft carriers alongside the USS Sable, tasked with training naval aviators in carrier takeoffs and landings. In fact, Sable had once been a sidewheel steamer too, the SS Greater Buffalo, built in 1924. The choice of the Great Lakes for these operations was strategic too, offering a safe, controlled environment away from the threat of enemy submarines and allowing for nearly year-round operations, albeit limited by winter ice. It was also a question of convenience and making the least impact on Navy resources. If Wolverine had been training on the open ocean, for example, instead, then an escort force of destroyers would be needed every time she left port. Operating primarily out of Chicago alongside USS Sable, the Wolverine played a crucial role in the training of thousands of Navy pilots. The 2 unusual ships came to be known as the Corn Belt Fleet. These aviators would go on to play a pivotal role in the Navy's aerial campaigns in the Pacific, contributing significantly to the Allied victory. The training operations aboard the Wolverine were not without their challenges though, including navigating the unpredictable weather of the Great Lakes and accommodating the limitations imposed by the vessel's original design. They weren't real aircraft carriers after all. There were no hangars or storage decks, elevators, or anything like that. Plus, the ships weren't fast enough to create the adequate wind conditions required for safe landings, so on calm days, operations had to be halted entirely. But despite these hurdles, the Wolverine and her semi-sister ship, the Sable, provided invaluable service in preparing naval aviators for the rigours of carrier operations. The USS Wolverine was decommissioned in November 1945, shortly after the end of World War II. It had been an unusual end to such a unique ship, but C&B had served her country well and was scrapped after a successful 3-decade-long career. As a fun little footnote, it turns out that the owners, the C&B Transit Company, had vastly inflated the value of the ship when they sold it to the government, who, when they found out, were not happy and hunted down more than $250,000 from C&B stockholders. It wasn't very patriotic of C&B, wouldn't you say? One of the strangest looking classes of warship is the Monitor. They're really like the love child between a battleship and a destroyer. Some monitors look just like something a 5-year-old might draw for fun, but monitors played a very real role in many of the world's navies, and one of the strangest of the bunch is the Italian vessel Faa di Bruno. Monitors were not named after the lizard. The class was given its name by the famous USS Monitor of 1861, a Union ironclad made famous by the indecisive Battle of Hampton Roads, when that warship and a Confederate contemporary spent a whole day blasting shots at each other to no real effect. The concept was simple: a warship armed with a big turret gun sitting as low in the water as possible to minimise its silhouette. The low freeboard meant the class weren't very good seakeepers, and their operations were reserved for shallow coastal work. During the First World War, the Monitor had found success as a shore bombarding vessel, and a simple and cost-effective method of mounting battleship guns on small hulls. Eventually, navies moved away from the shallow freeboard of earlier designs, and 20th century monitors began to more resemble destroyers, with tall hulls more suited to open ocean, but still fielding disproportionately massive guns. In 1916, the proposed Italian Francesco Caracciolo class of battleship was cancelled thanks to material shortage. It left the Navy with a sudden surplus of big guns. Guns which could make a difference in the war at sea. Instead of letting them go to waste, plans were drawn up quickly for a Monitor to take them to sea. Faa di Bruno was the result, a confused hodgepodge of a ship that had more in common with an island fort than with a ship of the line. She was powered by 2 triple expansion steam engines discarded from British torpedo boats that pushed her to a maximum speed of 3.3 knots, about walking pace. Now, if that seems a bit reckless, fear not, because her maximum service speed was limited to just 2.5. The Faa di Bruno's crew was made up of 45 officers and enlisted men who were squeezed into her 182-foot, 55.5-metre long hull. When people describe the construction of monitors as being cheap and cheerful, they're not embellishing. But Faa di Bruno was quite unique, even in comparison to other monitors of the time. Her flanks and decks were built to a prismatic shape, like the armoured shell of a turtle, with the sides angled downward to guard against incoming shells and her extremely low freeboard making her harder to sight and hit. Her deck surface was bare in typical monitor fashion, but featured a towering tripod mast which rose up behind the main gun turret and supported a protected bridge. Speaking of main gun turrets, yeah, wow, the massive 15-inch, 381mm guns were housed twinned in a revolving turret. I seriously cannot even imagine what it would have been like to be aboard this thing when those guns went off. Her hull, in addition to its prismatic shape, also had a concrete cofferdam 9.5 feet or 2.9 meters thick for added protection. Faa di Bruno was expected to engage enemy shore installations, so it was thought she'd need to be protected mostly from field artillery. So to that end, her protection was quite well thought out. It would be pretty hard to hit this thing from a couple of miles away with your 8cm field gun. Despite their unusual design, construction and purpose, Italy actually invested in 14 monitors for their navy. They were designed to specifically meet 3 requirements. First, in being able to carry heavy, long-range artillery to disrupt the front line and allow a breakthrough in the Austro-Hungarian lines because the big battleship caliber guns had a maximum range of nearly 20 kilometers or 12.5 miles. Second, there'd need to be stable gun platforms to maximize accuracy and fire effect. And finally, they needed to be able to operate in extremely shallow coastal waters. To that end, Faa di Bruno, despite having virtually nothing above the waterline, featured only 7 feet, or 2.2 meters of ship, below the waterline. Now, to offset the dangerous propensity for rolling and even capsizing, she was given the beam, or the width, of an Oceanliner or battleship, even though she was shorter than a destroyer. The Faa di Bruno and fellow monitor Alfredo Capellini did play a small role in the 11th of 12 battles of Isonzo. These were a series of conflicts between the Austro-Hungarians and Italian armies fought in the latter part of 1917. The Faa di Bruno and Alfredo Capellini, along with 2 British monitors, bombarded the Austro-Hungarian positions just as they had been designed to do, and although the battle was a victory for the Italians, the role of the monitors probably had very little to do with it. A few months after the Battle of Isonzo, the Faa di Bruno was hit by a storm, driven ashore and badly damaged. Now, perhaps signalling her importance to the Italian Navy as a whole, she was left stranded and not salvaged for almost a year. The Faa di Bruno was decommissioned in 1924, but returned to service as a floating battery under the name GM-194 at the beginning of World War II. The aging vessel was towed to Genoa, where she would spend the rest of the war. She was there when the Royal Navy bombarded the port in February 1941, and even fired off 3 shots in return, but that was all. After the Italian armistice, the strange vessel was captured by the Germans, who somehow thought she might be of some use and wanted to turn her back into a monitor, but the war ended before those plans ever came to pass. Ultimately, Faa di Bruno was scuttled in 1945 and dismantled. She was a strange ship, to be sure, with a rectangular profile and a sluggish manoeuvrability, but in some ways, she should be considered a success because she'd been designed to be a stable gun platform for the big 15-inch battleship rifles, and she was able to do just that for nearly 30 years. But as far as unhinged warship designs go, it's hard to think of anything more off the wall than Italy's first proper monitor. So there you have it, a batch of history's weirdest warships. But thankfully, there are plenty more out there. So join us next time as we revisit some of the strangest warship designs from history, and let us know down in the comments which ones you'd like to see us cover next.